Hello everyone, this is Stacy and I'm going to get you started on our chapter 9 on digestion. If you've got your PowerPoint with you, I'm going to be addressing mainly the first few slides or the first few objectives on our study guide, and we'll end with the small intestine and pick up with the large intestine on Wednesday when we're live again. So if you take a look at this picture here, the pathway that we've got over here is a very linear pathway. You should practice listing these organs in order from mouth to anus. And so again, this is usually a very linear process, step by step, one-way flow, unless we have an upset stomach, and then you probably have experienced where maybe you have some reflux or vomiting where things start to go the other direction. These accessory organs over here have played a role either in our current digestion, or in the case of the appendix, we'll look at the role it played in our evolutionary history. And so food doesn't pass through these organs, but yet they do have or have had some type of a role, either in creating some type of a chemical used in digestion or storing it. So again, we'll look at that on Wednesday when we are live. So to begin with, these, depending on where you are in the digestive tract or the GI tract, gastrointestinal, you can find up to 4 of these layers of tissue. And so the innermost is the mucosa. The one next to that, going a little bit outer, is the submucosa. Outside of that is a layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis. And then the very outermost is a layer of serous membrane called the serosa. You already know that as the peritoneum when we are in the abdominal pelvic cavity. And so you can associate each of these functions here. We'll talk about each one as we kind of go through. But you should definitely practice naming these. So going from, in this case here, my order is the innermost, and then working eventually to the serosa, which is the outermost. Okay, so pay attention to those prompts. I could ask you to list them from the inner to the outer or the outer to the inner. So practice that in both directions. See if you can list those on your own without using any notes. So here's a visual of that as well. Again, the mucosa and the serosa are going to be epithelial tissue. The submucosa is a combination. You can see that we have the blood vessels, so providing some nourishment and picking up any carbon dioxide waste from these tissues as they're working. There's a nervous supply, as you can see here on the picture. Here's the names here. That the yellow line is representing the nervous supply to this, which we know if you've ever delivered a speech or something where your nerves, you might be a little nervous, and that can definitely impact your digestive tract. As well as this little green line representing our lymphatic vessels that would be picking up any escaped fluid, cleaning it, and then returning it eventually back to the bloodstream. The muscularis is, again, know that is smooth muscle that is involuntary. So from the time you swallow your food until the time you are dashing to the restroom, that is going to be out of your voluntary control, because smooth muscle is going to be contracting and moving that along. And then again, the very outermost layer is that serosa. So to begin with, in the mouth, where the digestive process starts, so even before food even gets into our mouth, just the thought of food, we have 3 sets of salivary glands. You can see their location here, that are going to start secreting saliva to help moisten the food and make it more movable and easier to swallow. But then also we have an enzyme that's called amylase that's in our saliva, so we call it salivary amylase. And so amylase is in our saliva that's going to start to digest the carbohydrates. So specifically, if you stop this video and run to the kitchen and grab a cracker or a piece of bread that contains starch, which again, remember, is a polysaccharide, very large carbohydrate, and chew it longer than you normally would. So, maybe 2 minutes, so it's going to become a pretty liquidy, pasty substance. You will start to notice that it starts to taste very sugary and less starchy. And that's because amylase is starting to work and breaking the bonds of that large polysaccharide and break it down into a smaller disaccharides, which are going to taste kind of sugary because that's called maltose. Okay, so the pathway here is starch to maltose. Okay. At this point then, the tongue would help you move that ball of food. So a bolus is just the technical term for the ball of food, and move it towards your pharynx, which you might know the pharynx is your throat. So again, that pharynx is the pathway, not just for food, but also for air as well. And start to move it down then your esophagus. And so from the esophagus, there's going to be, again, smooth muscle contractions. We call that peristalsis. So again, it's involuntary. We would find peristalsis not just in the digestive tract, but also in the reproductive system when we look at how an egg is propelled down, let's say, the fallopian tubes to possibly meet up with a sperm cell and be fertilized. So peristalsis is anytime we see smooth muscle contractions. So here we have that happening in the esophagus, moving it towards the stomach, and then even there's a lot of churning happening in the stomach. So that is, again, continued peristalsis that's physically churning and moving your food, breaking it down into smaller pieces. If we take a look at the structure of the cell wall, again, you'll see our same 4 layers going from the inner to the outermost. And if we zoom into specifically this mucosa, you will see 3 types of cells, okay, secreting 3 different chemicals to aid in the digestive process. And so notice they're lining these gastric pits. Okay, so we're going to take a look at those 3 types of cells and the stuff that they're secreting. Okay, so the first one is secreting hydrochloric acid. You could abbreviate that HCl. And that's secreting a solution that's a pH of 2, so a very strong acid on the pH scale. And that acid is not responsible for directly digesting food, but instead it's activating something called pepsinogen. Okay, so when you see the gen here, it's an inactive form. So this is an inactive enzyme. But when hydrochloric acid contacts it, it actually takes that gen off, and it actually makes it then pepsin, which is the active enzyme that is going to begin protein digestion. Okay, so carbohydrate digestion occurs in the mouth, the pharynx, really even the esophagus, because you've swallowed amylase with that food. But then when we hit the stomach, that pH of 2 is not going to be what that enzyme amylase likes. So carbohydrate digestion ceases, and now protein digestion begins with the enzyme pepsin. Okay, so new enzyme to practice. So really, hydrochloric acid activates our pepsinogen and makes it pepsin. And then we also have some mucus secreting cells that really have a protection function. So knowing we have a pH of 2, that acidity would be damaging normally, but that mucus membrane kind of coats the lining of the stomach and protects it. So if someone you know or you yourself has had an ulcer, It's possible that you're producing too much acid in your stomach, either from stress or maybe your diet, and so that mucous membrane just can't um, give you enough protection, and so that ulcer is a hole in that lining of the stomach. Okay. So there's another bacterium that we've known about for quite a while, and there was a scientist by the name of Barry Marshall. And Barry believed, his hypothesis was that this particular bacterium, Helicobacter pylori, is responsible for stomach ulcers. And so pharmaceutical companies weren't very excited about that possibility, because they like and they produce a lot of profits from selling people a lot of remedies just to reduce the amount of acidity in their stomach. And so you have to just keep buying it, keep taking it, keep spending money on that treatment, but not really having a cure to your ulcer. And so Barry Marshall, if it's believed that it's a bacterium that causes it, you could take an antibiotic, and that means that you're cured. And so in order to prove this, Barry Marshall and the colleagues in his lab, they drank Helicobacter pylori, there's the abbreviation for it. They developed stomach ulcers and took an antibiotic, and they were cured. And so we've actually found that really anywhere from 80 to 90% of ulcers, either in the stomach or the first part of the small intestine, are caused by this bacterium H. pylori. So it's possible, again, if you've had an ulcer, it could be that you took an antibiotic and hopefully you have a cure. Unfortunately, the other side of this is we found that it also does increase the rate of stomach cancers as well. So I'm imagining Barry Marshall's colleagues maybe not being very pleased with being a part of that experiment. So that's kind of the good and the bad news of Helicobacter pylori. So not only ulcers, but also maybe increased risks of some stomach cancers as well. So at this point, the substance that's moving out of your stomach is not really recognizable as food anymore. And so really, we would call that material chyme. So when you see chyme, chyme, it produces a k sound. It's kind of a liquidy, pasty substance. So if you think about the food that you ate maybe 2 to 6 hours ago, it's finally moving on into past the stomach into the small intestine. Okay. So the small intestine has lots of activity. By default, if I ask you where something's happening and you don't know, have the highest probability of getting it right if you say small intestine. It's going to be neutralizing acidity. It's going to be adding lots of digestive enzymes to break down anything that hasn't been fully digested yet. So we're going to hit those proteins one more time with something called trypsin. Instead of pepsin, now it's trypsin. We've got some amylase again, so much like what was in the mouth, we have again, that's going to work on the carbs. And then our lipids that we haven't even really touched at all are going to be hit with an enzyme called lipase. And so trypsin, amylase, and lipase are your 3 digestive enzymes that correspond to these 3 nutrients. Okay. So really, there's some absorption happening in the mouth, a little bit in the stomach, but really about 90% of what you eat is going to be absorbed in the small intestine. And that's why, if you're preparing for some type of a athletic event or something like that, you really have to plan ahead the day before and think about the food that you're eating. So that's where I'm going to quit today, and I will see you Wednesday.